November 5, 1990, congressional legislation was signed into law, freezing 50% of U.S. aid to the military of El Salvador. Release of the aid is based in part on the U.S. State Department's evaluation of the human rights performance of both sides in the 11-year-old Civil War. Many of the incidents in the following report from El Salvador occurred during the period November 29th through December 13th, 1990, when this newly passed U.S. legislation required the State Department to closely monitor and evaluate the actions of both the FMLN and the Salvadoran government and its military. The Salvadoran Military's Information Agency, COPREFA, refused our requests for an interview. The government's Human Rights Agency canceled a scheduled interview. The U.S. Embassy would not allow a videotaped interview. Many of the Salvadorans we spoke to would not allow their full names and identities to be used for fear of reprisals by Salvadoran military and security forces. The people of El Salvador are caught in a web of terror, trapped between the military forces of the Arena government and the guerrilla forces of the FMLN. No one is safe in this civil war. Over the last 11 years, the United States has sent more than $4 billion in aid to El Salvador's military forces and government. Over these same 11 years, more than 75,000 civilians have been killed or disappeared. Thousands more have been tortured. Today, the Salvadoran people continue to suffer as a persistent pattern of brutal human rights violations grips the nation. Who's behind the killings, the disappearances, the torture? Has U.S. aid contributed to peace and democracy in El Salvador, or merely strengthened a military regime that wages low-intensity warfare on its own citizens? The answers to these questions may determine the future status of U.S. aid to El Salvador. Who's abusing the Salvadoran people, the government and military, or the FMLN? Amnesty International says the great majority of the human rights violations are committed by the Arena government and its military forces.
But the torture that the government does, and some of the bodies that we've seen have had the faces chopped away, the faces burned, the eyeballs gouged out, cigarette burnings, electrical shocks, cigarettes on the genitals and the breasts of women, repeated rapes, humiliation.
But Salvadoran President Cristiani's chief of staff blames the FMLN.
The FMLN is a hardcore, violent, very violent, Marxist-Leninist organization that is an amalgamation of 5 different guerrilla groups.
But civilians living in the countryside say government forces attacked them. The village of San Simon is in the state of Usulután. It lies along the Lempa River, where Salvadoran armed forces massacred 200 civilians, mostly women and children, in 1981. Residents of San Simon say government forces in U.S.-supplied planes and helicopters bomb and strafe them an average of 2 to 4 times a year. When we visited San Simon on December 9th, 1990, the village had been attacked that morning.
Here we are very sad. Our community is full of children and adults, and the helicopter was attacking us, so we're a cooperative. And here we are, between the rock and the hard place, suffering.
The walls of the San Simon school are pocked with bullet holes from a previous attack by government military forces. Villagers say a teacher and 2 children were inside at the time. North of San Simon, teenage girls are reportedly being raped by members of the Salvadoran military. A social worker says the women are threatened with death if they report these crimes.
Up to now, we don't know one case where the rape has been caused by the FMLN. All the cases mentioned before have been caused by the army, the government army. The army comes into the villages pretending to attack guerrillas and have a shootout. They are all lies. They come into the homes, take the young girls out anytime, and they rape them. Then they threaten them, and they make sure they know that if they say a word, they will be killed, and their families will be killed. Out of fear, those girls say nothing.
The rural hamlet of La Mora in the state of Cuscatlan was bombed by the Salvadoran military on November 29, 1990. 7 U.S.-supplied planes rocketed and machine-gunned the town. Grenades exploded on rooftops as terrorized residents huddled inside. The ceiling in this bedroom was ripped open as children lay on the bed below. Residents of La Mora blame the military for these and similar attacks, but the Minister of the Interior says it's the FMLN that attacks civilians, especially during their second offensive. With the many children, the many old people, with the many women, including pregnant women, that died in this offensive. These are not military targets. Down the road, another resident of La Mora points out the damages to his home. He says nearly 100 soldiers bombed his property and terrorized his family for 7 hours. The woman who lives here says that more than 30 soldiers stormed her house as bombs were falling nearby. She said they fired into the home where she and her family were hiding and then accused them of collaborating with the guerrillas.
We said we don't collaborate with either side. But they said, that's not true. You don't collaborate with us. But they collaborate with the guerrilla. That's not true. With nobody. So nobody can accuse us of collaborating with the other side. That's what we said to them. But then they took my husband. They took him to interrogate him.
Juana joined a group of Salvadorans and Americans requesting that the U.S. Embassy protect La Mora from further attacks by the military. The group asked an embassy human rights officer to visit the village and document the damage. In the capital city of San Salvador, the human rights of students, labor leaders, teachers, priests, and nuns are also being violated. The Arena Party says it's because they're members of the FMLN.
Then you have union people. Students are very much members of the FMLN. And then you have intellectuals, leftist intellectuals who also are members of the FMLN. So it's an amalgamation of different groups.
But Amnesty International disagrees.
What they try to do is first, as the military talks about, is they try to cut off the head of the opposition. Sometimes those may be the union leaders, it may be the students, it may be the teachers, it may be the priests, the nuns, the religious workers that they go after. They try to take away the moral authority, or those people who talk about justice, and then they go after everybody else. On top of what you have there in that country is you have some random killings, some torture being done by the guerrillas, which unleashes even more torture and death by the extreme right and by the death squads and by the government.
A woman who works with the 10,000 residents of San Salvador left homeless by a major earthquake in 1986 describes how she was tortured by the Salvadoran military.
So they start punching you here and there, on your head, everywhere, blindfolded, tied up. So we had to stand there for 72 hours without sleeping, without eating, without drinking a drop of water, standing up without moving, because if out of exhaustion you fell, they start kicking you all over again. The last day they put the plastic hood on my head. They threw in this hood, cigarette smoke and snot. They put it on my head tight. 2 men sat on me, my hands tied. I felt I was being strangled. I couldn't breathe any longer. They put that hood on 5 times. The 5th time I said, please stop torturing me. I cannot say what you want me to say I am, because I am not who you say I am. And if you feel I'm a burden to the society, kill me, I yelled. I couldn't almost talk any longer at that point. That's when the torture stopped. That's the torture they do there in the military quarters, in the Hacienda Police, the National Police, the National Guard, and all the military posts. And the torture they inflict on people only because of voicing what they need, asking for what we need, working to survive. For that they torture us, and that's what our armed forces and our government are all about.
Another persecuted group is Comadres, 500 women who try to find those killed or disappeared.
What people have to understand in a country like El Salvador, you can be considered dangerous to the government if you are just raising questions about the disappearance of your family member.
They seek to punish the assassins and provide support and medical services to the families and orphans of the disappeared. 2 women were killed when Comadre's headquarters was bombed in 1989. The group's director says she was raped repeatedly by a military officer while imprisoned. It's awful. It's repulsive. He said, "I'm going to rape you, but you better not tell anybody about it tomorrow." I said, "If you don't do it, I won't tell. You don't have to do it." I began to fight him because I was angry, but he took off my clothes, and he was saying, "Do you like it?" He caressed me and pinched me. And how do I explain? It's something difficult to understand. I try not to be affected by it. When he was done, he hugged me and said, "Maybe I won't let you leave because I liked it." The offices of FENASTRAS, the National Federation of Salvadoran Trade Unions, was bombed by the Salvadoran military in October 1989. 10 people were literally blown to pieces, and many more were injured. Juan Jose Hueso, a director of the Federation, was imprisoned for a year and a half and tortured. It's true that several points presented by the FMLN coincide with our points. Sure, we agree with some of their ideas, but that doesn't mean that we're part of the FMLN. This has been a struggle supported by the government to make us look like a front for the MFLN. But that's not true. We have our own legal recognition. We are recognized by the Ministry of Labor. And we don't carry arms. Our arms are the labor code and the several petitions for revindications. But the government, in order to justify its repression, to justify its terrorist actions against us, say we are the FMLN. Many Americans don't know what's done with their tax money. Their taxes are used to bomb houses full of children, old people and women. And they don't know it. The Salvadoran government's Minister of the Interior acknowledges the military has committed atrocities against the civilian population, but he says it's the work of a few rogue officers.
Because there have been occurrences which are horrible, distasteful, in which certain elements of the Salvadoran military have been involved. And this is very unfortunate because there is not a distinction made between the entire military institution and some of the occurrences of certain elements of the army. And it's not an institutionalized practice, although some people might see it that way. It's just isolated incidents of certain people, just as in organizations all around the world, certain incidences might occur involving people who are members of certain organizations, but do not involve the organization itself.
Again, Amnesty International disagrees, saying the military's problem is widespread and systemic.
Well, it is very systemic, and it's systemic in the fact that the government has allowed it to go on. They've used it to their advantage, and they've participated in it. It is part of the system in El Salvador. It has not changed in the last 10 years.
On the side of the assassinations of the 6 priests killed by Salvadoran military forces in November 1989, we spoke with a colleague of the slain Jesuits. We asked Father Rogelio Pedros, who fears for his life on a daily basis, why the priests were killed.
Because they were who couldn't be silent with the reasons. Because they were there and couldn't be accused of anything. They had no legal reason to take them to the court. They had no legal reason to jail them or deport them. So they killed them. As this university says, for being at the service of the Salvadorian people, or for trying to make the injustice a little bit less.
The U.S. Congress cut a portion of its aid to El Salvador, in part because the Salvadoran government wasn't conducting a thorough investigation of the massacre of the priests. But the Arena government says the investigation has been professional and complete.
We are now in the midst of implementing a judicial reform process in this country. It is not something that you can do overnight, but nevertheless we feel extremely pleased with the way that the judicial system in general, and Judge Zamora in particular, has handled this case.
The Interior Minister agrees, saying international experts approved of the way the investigation was conducted. But Amnesty International doesn't see it that way.
We have yet to see a full investigation. What the government has tried to do on publicly notable cases is to single out some soldiers and say they were the ones responsible.
Lower
echelon individuals, when really, in fact, the decisions, everyone knows, came at a higher level. We would ask that the government allow individual investigators to go in and to provide the information and to see that the perpetrators were prosecuted. I don't think this will happen under the present government.
Has U.S. foreign aid furthered the cause of peace in El Salvador? Its government says yes, but most Salvadorans we spoke to say no. A political opposition leader comments on American aid and the cause of peace.
The reason why we have been waging a war, one of the most important reasons why we have been waging a war for more than 10 years, because of American aid. So in that sense, I would say that American aid with the American taxpayer has not helped for peace, but just the opposite, to help for more destruction, more prolongation of suffering and war.
Dr. Ungo also says it takes more than an election to make a democracy.
It doesn't have any valid. We have free elections if we don't have democratic elections. I mean, there is not just important to win, but the winner has power, and not the power remains on the hands of the army. So the votes are the real source of power, and not the guns.
Despite the documentation of ongoing human rights violations against Salvadoran civilians, perpetrated mostly by the Salvadoran military, and despite the fact that the Arena government either cannot or will not stop this abuse, and despite the fact that the State Department has been mandated to monitor and report human rights abuses by both the Salvadoran military and the FMLN, President Bush authorized the release of $42.5 million in military aid to El Salvador on January 15, 1991. Reporting from El Salvador, Susan DeBrava for Behind the Headlines. Getting humanitarian aid to the people in a country like El Salvador is a problem. Inadequate monitoring of aid distribution, civil war, and government corruption make it difficult to get the aid where it's needed. An assistant to U.S. Congressman George Brown says most U.S. non-lethal aid ends up in Salvadoran military coffers.
That leaves the other $320 million as economic and developmental assistance. And studies have shown that approximately 3/4 of that $320 million really go toward military purposes in the war effort. So it leaves really only about $80 million out of $400 million that goes towards anything that can be called developmental assistance. And unfortunately, the people I saw down here this past week told me they've never seen any U.S. aid or even any Salvadoran government aids.
If the U.S. government can't or won't get aid to those who desperately need it, can the large international relief organizations deliver? An American doctor who's been delivering medical aid to El Salvador for 10 years says no, because the high-profile relief organizations try to remain apolitical.
There are organizations that try to do that, like the International Committee of the Red Cross, like DRI, like UNICEF. But unless one is willing to get in El Salvador and confront the government with their practices, it's very hard to carry out those missions. And most agencies aren't willing to involve themselves to that extent, because confronting the government, even in a respectful way based on international law, is to invite being labeled a subversive.
The director of Santa Barbara-based Direct Relief International says aid can find its mark if the distribution is monitored.
You have a lot of leverage because you can restrict your donations by virtue of saying, if we don't have control, if we don't have documentation, if you won't allow us to spot check, then basically we'll go somewhere else.
The DRI admits it has no staff in El Salvador and relies on written reports, photographs, and pre-announced visits to verify the aid deliveries. And sometimes this system breaks down. Take, for instance, the case of humanitarian aid raised at Santa Barbara's Beachside Festival. Clothing manufacturers Georgianne and Mylan Melvin raise thousands of dollars every year for the people in El Salvador. They convince their garment industry pals to donate merchandise, and all the proceeds go to help those ravaged by the Salvadoran Civil War. In 1989, they gave $20,000 to DRI and earmarked it for specific Salvadoran clinics. DRI gave it to the Salvadoran American Foundation, or FUSAM, to disperse.
The shipment went down, and it turned out that it was not distributed to our clinics, and we were very upset.
Carlos attributes the snafu to miscommunication and says she hasn't had a problem with FUSAM since then. Mylan Melvin says he was disappointed, but not surprised, since the president's wife sits on the FUSAM board.
President Cristiani's wife is involved with it. So that means that the aid was already politicized in the sense that it has gone to an organization that works with the right-wing military government in El Salvador.
Carlos claims Mrs. Cristiani helps raise funds for FUSAM and isn't involved with policy decisions. Melvin's decided to try a different route after the 1990 Beachside Festival. They decided to deliver the aid themselves. The aid was sent to San Antonio, Texas, and put in trucks as part of a Pastors for Peace caravan. The aid made its way through Mexico without a hitch, and the caravan continued through Guatemala without incident. No problems arose until they reached the Salvadoran border.
Sharon and I have just been informed that Sharon, myself, Joe Hackel, and Lucius, when he arrives, are not going to be allowed into El Salvador.
Leader Tom Hansen and 3 other caravan members were denied entry into the country despite prior approval and visas. But caravan participants were prepared for trouble and quickly moved into nonviolent civil disobedience right in the immigration office.
Retírense, por favor, de aquí. Miren, es que yo estoy atendiendo al público y ustedes no me dejan aquí. Ya van a venir los buses y esto se va a poner.
Their perseverance prevailed, and after 48 hours of bureaucratic delay, the caravan and its cargo were allowed into El Salvador. The humanitarian aid was then held up in customs for several more days in San Salvador. When the aid was finally released, the Melvins and the church people and human rights activists from the caravan began delivering the aid to non-governmental agencies, or NGOs as they're called. Many self-help Salvadoran citizen groups say NGOs have a better track record than the government of getting aid to the people. But the vice minister to the Salvadoran president warns of distributing aid through NGOs.
What you must guard against is in organizations or individuals who present themselves to represent the poor and who may actually funneling aid to terrorists. That is the one thing you should guard against.
But a man who works in the countryside with the desperately poor says aid channeled through NGOs stays within the communities.
When you talk about, when someone will say that the aid that the communities receive through NGOs that will end up in the hands of the subversives, I think that, again, is just a political justification of trying to control any aid that may come to the country.
The Salvadoran Minister of the Interior says humanitarian aid should go through the government and not to specific communities.
Sometimes when aid comes that has a specific destination, that could create some problems because there might be some communities who might need this aid more than the communities where the aid has been destined to.
But the Melvins chose to avoid going through the government.
The only aid getting down here is military aid. I don't care, you can call it the Americans can call it humanitarian, or they can call it their mammy if they want to, but it is not getting to the people down here in any form other than the military.
The first group to receive aid from the Melvins were the residents of Soledad, left homeless by a major earthquake in 1986. A social worker says the 500 families who have set up camp on top of this city dump never received any of the $129 million sent by the U.S. after the quake. We honestly know the money is in the hands of the government. They gave most of the money, the medicine, and the food to the armed forces. The comadres denounce human rights abuse. They help the families of the killed and disappeared. They give food and medicine to those who need them. And they appreciate the humanitarian aid. The American people are beautiful. They give what they have. They give what they can. It's dangerous for these people to even receive humanitarian aid. While this aid was being delivered, there was an undercover policeman across the street photographing the whole event. The Melvins also designated aid for 3 villages in the countryside. The pueblos are populated by Salvadoran refugees from the Civil War who fled to Honduras and have recently returned to what's left of their land. The people who live in San Simon Usulutan are rebuilding. The Melvins gave them money to finish this school. Malnutrition is rampant in Chalatenango. Los Almendras, La Mora, and Valle Verde received aid to increase their ability to feed themselves. The people who live here in this community will be receiving aid raised by the Beachside Festival. They'll be getting clothing, medicine, a tractor, and a truck to take their produce to market. The people in the town of Valle Verde planned a reception for their compadres at Flamingo Design, the Melvins, but like most foreigners, the government wouldn't allow the Melvins out in the countryside. The people were disappointed. What you've just seen about the delivery of humanitarian aid in El Salvador is happening all around the world. Either government corruption and civil war will have to be brought under control, or the world will have to reshape its aid delivery system, particularly because world disasters are growing at a faster rate than world finances. Reporting from El Salvador, Susan DeBrava for Behind the Headlines. That morning.
Here we are very sad. Our community is full of children and adults, and the helicopter was attacking us, so we're a cooperative. And here we are, between the rock and the hard place, suffering.
The walls of the San Simon school are pocked with bullet holes from a previous attack by government military forces. Villagers say a teacher and 2 children were inside at the time. North of San Simon, teenage girls are reportedly being raped by members of the Salvadoran military. A social worker says the women are threatened with death if they report these crimes.
Up to now, we don't know one case where the rape has been caused by the FMLN. All the cases...
electrical shock, cigarettes on the genitals and the breasts of women, repeated rapes, humiliation.
But Salvadoran President Cristiani's chief of staff blames the FMLN.
The FMLN is a hardcore, violent, very violent, Marxist-Leninist organization that is an amalgamation of 5 different guerrilla groups.
But civilians living in the countryside say government forces attacked them. The village of San Simon is in the state of Usulutan. It lies along the Lempa River, where Salvadoran armed forces massacred 200 civilians, mostly women and children, in 1981. Residents of San Simon say government forces in U.S.-supplied planes and helicopters bomb and strafe them an average of 2 to 4 times a year. When we visited San Simon on December 9, 1990, the village had been tortured. Today, the Salvadoran people continue to suffer as a persistent pattern of brutal human rights violations grips the nation. Who's behind the killings, the disappearances, the torture? Has U.S. aid contributed to peace and democracy in El Salvador, or merely strengthened a military regime that wages low-intensity warfare on its own citizens? The answers to these questions may determine the future status of U.S. aid to El Salvador. Who's abusing the Salvadoran people, the government and military, or the FMLN? Amnesty International says the great majority of the human rights violations are committed by the Arena government and its military forces.
But the torture that the government does, and some of the bodies that we've seen have had the faces chopped away, the faces burned, the eyeballs gouged out, cigarette burnings.
On November 5, 1990, congressional legislation was signed into law, freezing 50% of U.S. aid to the military of El Salvador. Release of the aid is based in part on the U.S. State Department's evaluation of the human rights performance of both sides in the 11-year-old Civil War. Many of the incidents in the following report from El Salvador occurred during the period November 29th through December 13th, 1990, when this newly passed U.S. legislation required the State Department to closely monitor and evaluate the actions of both the FMLN and the Salvadoran government and its military. The Salvadoran Military's information agency, COPREFA, refused our requests for an interview. The government's human rights agency canceled a scheduled interview. The U.S. Embassy would not allow a videotaped interview. Many of the Salvadorans we spoke to would not allow their full names and identities to be used for fear of reprisals by Salvadoran military and security forces. The people of El Salvador are caught in a web of terror, trapped between the military forces of the Arena government and the guerrilla forces of the FMLN. No one is safe in this civil war. Over the last 11 years, the United States has sent more than $4 billion in aid to El Salvador's military forces and government. Over these same 11 years, more than 75,000 civilians have been killed or disappeared. Thousands more have been tortured.